In psychological research, the population is who we're interested in learning about. Another part of research, though, is the what we're interested in. Each of the things we're interested in is called a variable. Basically, a variable is anything that, well, varies. As this definition notes, there are a lot of possibilities for types of variables we can study. Given that there are a lot of possibilities for variables, it might not be a surprise to hear that sometimes it's tricky to know what a researcher is talking about when they mention what they're studying. Even things that can be observed, like facial expressions, can be hard to define, and topics like love can be really tricky. Given that, researchers establish both conceptual and operational definitions for variables. The conceptual is more abstract, whereas the operational is the very specific way a variable is measured or manipulated. For example, the conceptual definition of a smile might be a facial expression involving muscles around the mouth and eyes. The operational definition would name exact muscles and the amount of movement. There's actually a whole system that defines face and body movement in terms of the muscles activated and how they're activated, and therefore what they represent. The conceptual definition of love might be positive feelings towards someone that lasts for a period of time. The operational definition would be a score on a particular questionnaire. You might have noticed the phrase measured or manipulated in the definition of an operational definition. As you might know, or will hear more about soon, that's an important distinction. First, though, I want to make sure you understand the difference. One way to think about it is by asking the question, does the researcher intentionally create differences in the amount or the level of the variable experienced by each participant? If so, it's manipulated. If not, it's measured. We can think about three broad categories of measurement: physiological, self-report, and observation, sometimes referred to as motor response. I have a feeling the ideas are pretty straightforward, but we want to make sure to note one thing. When we're talking about measurement, we're talking about specific processes and procedures. In other words, self-report is different than a casual conversation or even a questionnaire on the internet, and observation is different than people watching. One thing that can get a little confusing is that researchers have two reasons they might manipulate a variable, or that it appears they do. We typically talk about manipulated variables as part of an experiment. When we're investigating cause and effect, we manipulate variables to determine the effects. In those cases, the manipulated variable is known as the independent variable. Sometimes, though, a researcher appears to manipulate a variable, and they do it to create a context for the study. In those cases, it's part of the research design, but not used in a way that allows us to evaluate cause and effect related to that variable. For example, if we want to understand how responses to stress vary depending on personality, we would measure responses to stress, and we would measure personality, but we might want to make sure we're really measuring how participants respond when they're stressed, so we'd need to manipulate their stress levels. We could do that by telling them they need to take a very difficult test, and if they don't pass, they won't be able to graduate. We'll talk about ethics in a future unit.